What is contemporary architecture? It's generally accepted that characteristics of contemporary architecture include nonlinear and unadorned structure, but while there is no clear definition of what constitutes contemporary architecture, it comprises of a range of present-day building styles that often look radically different from one another, and sometimes from anything that has come before. This is thanks to myriad innovation in building materials and technique that have made contemporary architecture possible in all infinite iteration.
Contemporary architecture essentially refers to the style of architecture. For example, a house built this year according to current trends would be considered contemporary architecture. Some notable contemporary 21st century architects include Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Tadao Ando, Shigeru Ban, Santiago Calatrava, and the late Zaha Hadid who died at 65 in 2016, but whose oeuvre is still being built by the company she left behind. These contemporary architects are known for show-stoppingly expressive buildings rendered in unconventional, sometimes gravity-defying shapes that alter the landscapes in places around the world.
While they have all built ambitious large-scale buildings like Gehry's Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA or Nouvel's Philharmonie de Paris, many have also built private residences such as the Hadid-designed luxury condominiums at 520 West 28th Street overlooking NYC Highline. The era of contemporary architecture is generally thought to have begun sometime after the modern period of the first half of the 20th century, and the postmodern period that was a reaction to it beginning in 1960s and continuing through the 90s. Therefore, buildings from the late 20th century to the present moment might be referred to as work of contemporary architecture.
Sustainability is an important feature of contemporary architecture, with the use of recycled and natural materials, and attention to eco-conscious water and temperature-controlled building systems that are ever more seamlessly integrated and considered. This is vital in light of the climate change emergency that is in part a result of the environmental damage caused by buildings, which in the US account for 39% of CO2 emissions in 2011. Contemporary architecture is a free-for-all, but here are some elements that might help you identify a contemporary building in the wild. Curved lines, rounded forms, unconventional volumes, asymmetry, free-form shape, often floor plans, large, abundant windows, green roofs, living walls, integration into the surrounding landscape, integrated smart home technology, integrated customizable LED lighting.
The New York Five were a group of New York City architects whose work was featured in the 1972 book Five Architects. Mayer established his own firm in 1963. Early on, he received critical acclaim for the Smith House in Darien, Connecticut, the first of his so-called white buildings, which clearly built on Le Corbusier's pristine modernism of the 1920s and 1930s. During this time, he formed a loose association with the New York Five, a group of young architects who advocated a return to modernist rational architecture. The New York Five advocated for a return to modernist rational architecture. Architectural historians have described the work of the New York Five as a watershed moment in the history of postmodernism and modernist critics. First is Peter Eisenman, full name Peter David Eisenman. He was born on August 12, 1932 in Newark, New Jersey, USA. He is best known for his radical designs and architectural theories as Deconstructivism. Second is Michael Graves. Michael Graves was born on July 9, 1934 in Indianapolis, Indiana, United States. He died March 2, 2015 in Princeton, New Jersey. He was an American architect and designer who was a key figure in the postmodernist movement. Third is Charles Guattmi. He was born June 19, 1938 and died August 3, 2009. He was an architect from the United States. He was a principal at Guattmi Siegel and an associate architect and one of the 5 architects known in 1965 as the New York Five. Guattmi is best known for renovating Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York City in 1992. Fourth is John Quentin Hejduk. He was born July 19, 1929 and died July 3, 2000. He was a Czech-born American architect, artist, and educator who lived in New York City for most of his life. Hejduk is remembered for his deep interest in fundamental issues such as shape, organization, representation, and reciprocity. And the last is Richard Mayer. Full name of Richard Allen Mayer. He is an American architect known for his refinements and variations on classic modernist principles such as pure geometry, open space, and an emphasis on light.
Why is it called Brutalism? The concentration on material, texture, and construction in the Brutalist style result in extremely excessive forms. The term was first used by Alison Smithson in 1953 for an unfinished project for a house in Conville Place, Soho, in which she described its warehouse aesthetic of bare concrete bricks and wood as the first exponent of the new Brutalism. In England, it was first seen in the work of Le Corbusier for the late 1940s with the unit of rehabilitation in Marseilles. Rainier Banham, an architectural historian, reviewed Allison and Peter Smithson's school at Hampstead, Norfolk in 1955, and it was his unwavering approach to the display of the steel and bricks building and its service that gave rise to the concept. The genesis of the Brutalist design movement can be credited to French-Swiss modernist architect Le Corbusier, who over a career spanning 50 years, designed several buildings across the world and is known for precision reinforced concrete columns that could support the weight of the building. Bare concrete columns, for instance, were a signature aesthetic of his buildings. Characteristic of Brutalism. Brutalism was generally characterized by its rough, unfinished surface, unusual shape, heavy-looking materials, straight lines, and small windows. Modular elements were often used to form masses representing specific functional zone grouped into a unified whole. Generally speaking, Brutalist architecture was distinguished by its rough, unpolished surface, strange shape, materials that look heavy, straight lines, and small windows. Modular components were frequently employed to create masses that representing distinct functional zones and were grouped into a coherent whole. In addition to concrete, Brutalist structure frequently utilized brick, glass, steel, and wood tone.
Parallel to the expressionist visual and performing arts, which specifically emerged and predominated in Germany throughout the first half of 20th century, there was an architectural trend in Europe called expressionist architecture. This movement unique variation in Western and Northern Germany, as well as the Netherlands, is known as brick expressionism. Amsterdam School, one of the 3 main types of modern architecture is the expressionist architecture, international style, expressionist, and constructivist architecture. From 1910 through 1930, the German, Dutch, Austrian, Czech, and Danish avant-garde's work was initially referred to as expressionist architecture. Later, the definition broadened the phrase scope to include the rest of Europe and dated the term back to 1905. Today, the definition has been expanded even further to include any architecture, regardless of time or place, that demonstrates some of the characteristics of original movements like distortion, fragmentation, or expression of violent or extreme emotion. Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus, or groundbreaking art school in Germany. In addition to being one of the forerunners of modern architecture, the Bauhaus eschewed conventionally teaching strategies in favor of flexible artistic community that prioritized group learning and the production of integrated design projects. Later, the Bauhaus included mass production methods in creation, creating items and structure for a broad clientele. The school attracted renowned painters working in the fields and trained some of the most well-known figures in modernism. The Bauhaus and the Allied design movements had a significant global impact despite their comparatively brief existence. But this was especially true in the United States, where many of the artists fled Nazi persecution before and during the Second World War. The Bauhaus relocation from Weimar, Germany to industrial city of Dessau provided Gropius with a blank site on which to build. The buildings all utilize new industrial materials such as reinforced concrete and are geometric in design with flat roofs. Each space was carefully designed to reflect its function. Gropius founded the Bauhaus in Weimar, Germany in 1990 as a new kind of art school based around a holistic approach to creative discipline. Objective was to facilitate the creation of Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, in which building and everything in them were designed as a whole entity. Bruno constructed the prismatic glass dome building known as the Glass Pavilion for the Cologne Deutscher Werkbund exhibition in 1914. The concrete building had colored glass plates in lead. On the facade that serve as mirrors. Taut described his small temple of beauty as reflection of light whose colors began as the base with a dark blue and rose up through most green and golden yellow to culminate at the top in a luminous plain yellow. His glass pavilion is his best-known singular structure. For the 1914 exposition, he specifically built in the German Glass Industrial Association. They provided the funding for the building that served as a museum. The building was constructed when German Expressionism was at its height. The characteristic of Expressionism. The style was characterized by an early modernist adoption of novel materials, formal innovation, and very unusual massing. Sometimes inspired by natural biomorphic forms, sometimes by new technical possibilities offered by the mass production of brick, steel, and especially glass. Even though Expressionist architecture was individualized and frequently rejected aesthetic doctrine, it is nevertheless helpful to establish some standards that characterize it. Despite having a considerable deal for variety and differentiation, several elements are common to Expressionist architectural works and may be seen to varying degrees in all of them. Formal distortion for emotional impact. Giving symbolic or stylistic representation of inner experience precedence above realism. A persistent drive for the novel, inventive, and visionary. Abundance of written works and models, and conceptual discovery and representation being more significant than practical and end results. Frequently hybrid solution that cannot be reduced to a single idea. Themes of romantic natural occurrences such as rock formation, lightning, caves, and mountains. As a result, it is less florid and organic, which characterize it related contemporary Art Nouveau and more elemental and mineral. Make use of artisan craftsmanship, creative potential, the Rococo and Romanist style above the classical. Despite being a European movement, Expressionism has both Eastern and Western roots. It is equally influenced by Roman and Greek art and architecture as it is by Islamic, Egyptian, Indian, and Moorish works. The concept that architecture is an artistic creation.
Modernism sought to create a unified aesthetic for all the region. Modernism was a style of art that didn't require any pre-existing context. The ideology of modern design is adaptable and can be used in any part of the world. As a result, the loss of local and cultural significance may have played a role in the decline of tradition. This led to a rise in regional awareness. Many architects around the world came up with ideas that encourage the incorporation of regional features into their design. Instead of blindly accepting the standards of modern architecture, the architects attempted to critically rethink the design scenario. This marked the beginning of critical regionalism in architecture. Critical regionalism is a new form of design that is influenced by the specific needs and culture of the region in which it is created. Critical regionalism is a style of architecture that is closely related to local environment and showcases the cultural and regional features of a particular area. The campers also had provision designed to adapt to the local climate. The critical regionalism in architecture movement promoted the importance of local culture and values rather than blindly following the teachings of modernism.
The Church of the Light, Japan. In the small town of Ibaraki, 25 km outside of Osaka, Japan, stands one of Tadao Ando's signature architectural works, the Church of the Light. The Church of the Light embraces Ando's philosophical framework between nature and architecture through the way in which light can define and create new spatial perception equally, if not more so, as that of his concrete structures. Completed in 1989, the Church of the Light was a renovation to an existing Christian compound in Ibaraki. The new church was the first phase to a complete redesign of the site, later completed in 1999 under Ando's design aesthetic. The employment of simplistic materials reinforced the duality of the space. The concrete structures remove any distinction of traditional Christian motifs and aesthetic. Beside an intruded cross from the east-facing facade, the church is composed to a concrete shell. The concrete adds to the darkness of the church by creating a more humble, meditative place of worship. As a testament to minimalist architecture, the cross is void in the east-facing wall is the only prominent religious symbol present in the church. Characteristic of critical regionalism. A building might be classified as an example of critical regionalism if it has the qualities of modern architecture, while also taking into account the specific location it is located in, using the natural light to its advantage and enhancing the perceptive and kinesthetic experience.
Postmodern architecture began in the United States in the 1960s. As a critic against the traditional styles of architecture, the movement attempted to push beyond practical, boring, and muted design that ignore history and culture and replace tradition with personality by making reference to society. The postmodern style was conceptualized in the 1960s, influenced interior design in the 1970s, and hit its peak in the 80s. The style mirrored social issue at the time and made reference to history, geography, and pop culture. It evolved in 1990s and spread throughout Europe to Italy, France, and Spain before making its way to Japan. Today, postmodern style remain popular in architecture and design. The Lib House. Robert Venturi is a staunch follower of symbolism and believed that architect must respond to the reality and the popularity, both environment with building. Regarding the environment, he is often admired roadside buildings as simple as a decorated shed, as he has convinced that the buildings offered important design lessons that are often ignored. As a response to the site condition, the Lib House is designed with the idea of glorifying the ordinary, referred to Robert Venturi himself as banal box. The Lib House is a pop art influenced house with a huge number 9 greeting the visitor at the entrance. This depicts Venturi's use of signage in his design, followed by a crescent window on the side. This design was extremely constructing to the then existing landscape of the shore where clothesline and telephone poles were essential to landscape. This constructing difference in the architecture of the vicinity caused a lot of controversy and disapproval from the neighbors to the point where one of neighbor cut ties with the Lib after construction. The Glass House or the Johnson House by Philip Johnson. It's a historic house museum on Ponus Ridge Road, New Canaan, Connecticut, built in 1948 to 49. It was designed by architect Philip Johnson, his own residence. It has been called his signature work. Frank Gehry, this irrelevant and dynamic construction was completed in the late 20th century and is considered one of the iconic works of Gehry to have become one of the most relevant buildings of contemporary architecture. It is one of the 3 museums currently managed of Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. It extends by the river of Nervion, the forms of use to give a sense movement to the building belonging to the place as if the place awaited its construction. The characteristic of postmodernism. Postmodernism had firm decorative elements, asymmetry, bright colors, and then features often borrowed from earlier periods. Color and texture were unrelated to the structure or function of the building. What caused Deconstructivism? The rise of prominence of computer-aided design or CAD in contemporary architecture was a key factor in the development of Deconstructivism, as three-dimensional modeling enabled integrate design of complicated and unorthodox shapes and spaces. So what is Deconstructivism? Deconstruction is late 20th century philosophical movement primarily fathered by Derrida. It basically sought to undermine the preconceived beliefs surrounding reason and logic. Instead, Derrida argued that meaning from words, symbols, actually remembered symbols for later, it's what deconstructivist architecture is founded upon, or whatever of relationship, the yin-yang between things. Good exists only because of bad. A chair is a chair and has meaning to us as a chair because we know what isn't a chair. In addition, the meaning of the thing changes over time. Today, in 2016, a laptop has a particularly meaning and significance, but it will have the same meaning and significance in the 1,000 years. Today, if someone showed you a sword or armor, would you actually think they are taking that thing into battle, or would you think that they just were into collecting antique? Anyway, the whole point of this meaning of anything is fluid, always changing based on context, relationship to the other things, cultural attitude, gender, age, time, and other factors too.
Deconstructivism is the theoretical term that emerged within the art, architecture, and philosophical literature of the late 1980s and early 1990s. The movement refers mainly to an architectural language of displaced, distorted, angular forms, often set within conflicting geometries. With origins in the ideas of French philosopher Jacques Derrida, Deconstructivism generated an iconoclastic style of avant-garde whose principal architectural exponents included Coupe Himmelbau, Zaha Hadid, Bench-Nietzsche and partners Bernard Tschumi, Peter Eisenman, Morphosis, Rem Koolhaas, Daniel Libeskind, and Frank Gehry, among others. Actually, Deconstructivism philosophy is, in fact, not a new architectural style, nor is it avant-garde movements against architecture of society. It does not follow rules or acquire specific aesthetics, nor it is a rebellion against a social dilemma. It is the unleashing of infinity possibility of playing around with forms and volumes. Semiotics. How this relates to architecture. First off, let's define semiotics. A word maybe you learned in college and probably forgot about as soon as the class was over. It is the study of nonverbal communication and how we derive meaning from symbols. Now, take this through the same line of thinking Derrida applied to word symbols. Take of different meanings depending upon context, relationship to other things, cultural attitudes, time, and other factors too. A classical architecture example of fluidity of symbolic representation is how classical Greek columns, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian order received different response throughout history. In its inceptions, Doric columns were considered masculine, Corinthian was feminine, and Ionic was neutral. But hundreds of years later, during revivalist period of architecture, when these same columns were built, viewers responded saying that Corinthian was strong and straightforward, or in other words, masculine. Same column, different response. Who is right? This is when we would quote Le Corbusier and say, it is life that's always right, and the architect who's wrong. So now, what is deconstructivist architecture? It is basically saying, the hell with those symbols anyway, because who knows what they mean? It is about fragmentation challenging the idea of what a building of structure even is. So, late 20th century architects like Daniel Libeskind, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Peter Eisenman, and company said, let's make buildings that sway and wave like they're being blown around by the wind. Let's make them bend. Let's make them interact. Let's make them human. Let's make them not only stand out, but disrupt the system. Let's change the landscape, change cities, and change lives. Let's make weird-looking windows and build staircases to nowhere. Because what a staircase anyway?
The pioneer architects of Reconstructivism. First is Zaha Hadid. A British Iraqi architect was the first and only woman to have won the Pritzker Prize. Early in her career, she gained a reputation as a paper architect. Her sketches for designs being considered too avant-garde to be considered to be recreated in 1:1 scale. Her design addressed the challenges and opportunities in the 21st century. Her architecture was not a personal stamp on the world, but contributed to society's progress and ultimately to our individual and collective well-being. Second is Rem Koolhaas. Rem Koolhaas designed buildings such as the CCTV building in Beijing in 2012, reimagining skyscrapers as a loop, breaking away from the tradition of a strong rational structure defined by a great height. Koolhaas' architecture focused on layering programmatic elements leading to an environment of interaction. Professor in Practice of Architecture and Urban Design at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. He is often cited as a representative of Deconstructivism and is the author of Delirious New York, a retroactive manifesto for Manhattan. Third is Daniel Libeskind. Daniel Libeskind based an ideology that transcended consideration only to beauty in form and aimed to bring about architecture with inherent meaning. His works of the Jewish Museum Berlin and Dresden Military History Museum reflected the harsh past of the site and country. With this understanding deforming rational structures, Libeskind received further international attention after he won the competition to be the master plan architect for the reconstruction of the World Trade Center site, Lower Manhattan. Other buildings that he is known for include the extension to the Edinburgh Art Museum in the United States, the Grand Canal Theatre in Dublin, the Imperial War Museum North in Greater Manchester, England, the Michael Lichin Crystal at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada, the Felix Nussbaum House in Osnabrück, Germany, the Danish Jewish Museum in Copenhagen, Denmark, Reflection in Singapore, and the Wall Center at the Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan, Israel. Fourth is Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry created forms that define innovation and growth in architecture, defining the unlimited possibilities present in architecture. His designs are great examples of his philosophy he held in architecture, such as the Guggenheim Museum, Bilbao, Dancing House, Prague, and Louis Vuitton Foundation. In 1947, Gehry and his family immigrated to Los Angeles, where he soon began taking night classes at Los Angeles City College. He then studied architecture at the University of Southern California in 1949 to 1951 and 1954, and city planning at Harvard University in 1956 to 1957. After working for several architecture firms, including those of Victor Gruen in Los Angeles and André Remondet in Paris, he established his own company, Frank O. Gehry and Associates, in 1962 and its successor, Gehry Partners, in 2002. Reacting, like many of his contemporaries, against the cold and open formulaic modernist buildings that dotted many cityscapes, Gehry began experiment with unusual expressive devices and to search for a personal vocabulary.
The characteristic of Deconstructivism: explode architectural form into loose connections of related fragments, destroys the dominance of the right angle in the tube by using the diagonal line, rejects the idea of the perfect form for a particular activity, and rejects the familiar relationship between certain forms and certain activities.
Hello, ako yung editor nitong documentary na to. Alam kong marami pa rin kulang dito sa documentary namin, no, dahil naging limitado din yung oras namin sa pagre-research. Alam kong makakatulong ito para sa mga review and researches nyo. Thank you and good luck.